Awesome. So today we're looking at client-side JavaScript. We're getting set into the week of the front end, and now we're thinking about not just front end HTML and CSS, but front end JavaScript. At this point, you guys are probably pretty familiar with just JavaScript in general. And in some ways, we kind of learned JavaScript in the reverse order, in the sense that JavaScript started as a language for the browser, as a programming language, as a scripting language, so the browser or so our web experiences could be more dynamic, so that people could do things in websites. Only later on did Node get created. We're building a lot of our JavaScript applications in Node. Node allows us to use JavaScript, kind of a front-end scripting language, in our normal desktop environments, or in other words, as a back-end kind of language. So we're going to be taking it back to the roots and looking at JavaScript from the front-end perspective. We will be touching on things like client-side JavaScript. We'll go more into detail in the DOM. We'll look at front-end like browser events. We'll look at using dev tools and how you can use the tools available when you're using scripting on the front end. We'll look at jQuery, which is a library that extends some of the functionality or makes things easier with our front-end JavaScript. But yeah, let's jump right into it. So JavaScript was created as a browser language to make websites more dynamic. When you are looking at web pages, there's a lot of stuff that can be happening. And as a user, you can be interacting with your browser and with your page in many different ways. Because of this, they needed to develop JavaScript as an asynchronous language so that it could handle many separate things that could be occurring at the same time, or could be starting at the same time. If JavaScript were a purely synchronous language, it would be really hard to have sites like this where lots of things are happening at the same time. Or let's look, these guys are really cool to look and get front-end inspiration from. Here as a user, when I scroll over each of these titles, lots of things are happening at the same time. And it needs to be able to handle the events of me clicking on something. Whoa, this one's crazy. I think this is just a portfolio for some guy. But all these different things, the point is JavaScript needed to be able to handle and interact with HTML and the styling associated with each of these HTML tags in a dynamic way. I've got a nice image here. We've been talking about the DOM, and we've been looking at it mostly in terms of when we were looking at dev tools and the Elements tab, we saw this breakdown of our HTML. And we've been talking about how in here, there's a div. And we might have been referring to this as a DOM element. The DOM, or the document object model, is actually derived from JavaScript. Before JavaScript existed, we still had HTML in the browser, and we still had this kind of nested arrangement of HTML tags, but they were just purely static HTML. The DOM, or document object model, abstracts these purely HTML tags to be JavaScript objects that contain information on what the tag is, what their attributes that they have, and it is arranged in a tree. So each of these DOM elements, this div here, for example, is a node in a tree. It has many children, potentially, which are elements inside of its HTML markup. So the DOM is like the JavaScript object model for the HTML things that appear in our page. It's not just the HTML itself. From like a broad macro level, the DOM is broken up into a few different parts. We have an event object, a window object, a navigator object, and the document object. And that's kind of illustrated here in this picture. The navigator object is a representation of the entire browser. So the navigator in this case would be Chrome. The window object represents the current browser window, or because we have like tab browsers these days, another way of thinking of the window object is it's representing the current tab that you're on. So this is one window, this is another window, this is another window. Your document object, that makes up all of the HTML that goes into your page. So when we were looking at our elements, this doc type, everything that's included in this HTML document, that's being referenced by this document object. And then, of course, inside the document, you have kind of a hierarchy that depends on how your website is structured. You will most likely have a head and a body tag, but inside your body tag, it all depends up to you and how you put those HTML elements. Each of these like JavaScript objects that we're creating in the browser has a whole series of methods that we can now interact with. So JavaScript objects representing those things, and then we have functions and methods, so we can manipulate them in like a dynamic way. Another kind of like picture of how the DOM tree, when we're thinking of the document object, might be laid out. This, I only realized this yesterday, but this kind of makes the vampire tree a little less frustrating or useless because it's very similar to that vampire tree that we were thinking about. You have maybe a parent node, and if we need to find in our HTML document all the paragraph tags, we need to do like a tree traversal to look and find, for this child, do you have any paragraph tags inside, and so on and so forth. Luckily, with the document object model, we don't have to write the code on how those traversals work. There's an API or a set of functions that we can interact with that does like searching and allows us to grab particular pieces of this tree without having to think of like, are we doing a breadth or depth first search, and so on and so forth. But we can kind of think of our experiences with the vampire tree. So all of our client-side JavaScript is going to look syntactically the same as our Node JavaScript. The big difference is there's this API that we're exposed to where we can interact with the document object model. So instead of taking too much further time without seeing some code, let's bring up maybe like Wikipedia. We'll look at one of these. Here is an article. And I'm just going to bring up the console in DevTools. Any JavaScript we write in here is client-side JavaScript run immediately by the browser. And we can start to interact with those different DOM objects. We can look up document. And helpfully, it's going to highlight the document in its entirety. And if we do dot, we can see a whole bunch of methods associated with the document. A bunch of these we don't have to worry too much about. The main things we need to be concerned with when we're thinking about client-side JavaScript is how do we modify the kind of front-end aspects of the page. How do we add maybe new HTML tags into this layout? How do we change maybe this title from being bold and black to being bold and red? Different changes that we want to make updates to our current page. With Tweeter, we're thinking about when we post a new tweet, we want that new tweet to show up. And we don't necessarily want a page refresh when that happens. In order to accomplish this, we're going to have to use front-end JavaScript, and we're going to have to interact with the document. One function made available to us, well, a group of them are getter functions that let us find elements within the DOM.
Is that a search option, like the one that you're talking about? Like, we don't have to do traversal to find stuff. We just can get element by class, ID, whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a search.
So we can do get element by ID, get elements by class name, get elements by name. We have all these different options, and we can use these different functions on any node in the like DOM tree. So right now I'm using it on the root node because that's the one it's a global object that's made available to me. But if and we can look at this in a second, if I pick out from that tree, if I grab this h1 tag here, I can do a dot get elements by ID on this node and only search its direct descendants. Because we're doing a query right now on the whole document, we're essentially looking everywhere. But yeah, we don't have to think about how that search is happening. We're just going to go, and I'm going to cheat and kind of look in here. So we've got a ID on this header called first heading. And so we could do a get element by ID, and we could tell it to look for first heading. Ooh. And we see that HTML tag with all of the attributes associated with it were returned to us. We could save that reference to the object model or to this node if we want. We just declare a variable and we'd say maybe that's the title. Dot get element by ID, first heading. And then I can take that node that I've now saved, and I can do maybe another search on it. Of course, in this case, I don't think there's any children of this h1 tag, but I can do get attribute, and I can find out what its class is. It has a class of first heading. I could find out, I mean, it's not an image, but if it was an image, I could get the source attribute. And I can also set all these properties as well when I have access to the node. So I can take title, and I can say the style attribute I want to set to color red. And now I have the style changing in the browser. And you can do even like pretty powerful things. Like if we go so we've got like a bunch of images on this page. Let's go let images equal document.get element by tag name. And let's get all of the image tags. And images is now a collection of 21 nodes. We could grab a specific node from that collection. And this is this little book image. But we could also change, what the image's sources are. I could do it for the single book. So if we look and we find like a new image, on the videos. Yeah. So we could go images dot the 0th images. I want to set the source to this new guy, and we get little baby Yoda showing up. Or we could even say for all the images, so for each image of our images, I want to take that image and I want to set the source to what we have there. I'm also going to set the set source, which is an alternative way of setting an image's source, essentially. And now we have just all baby Yodas across the page. Woo! Of course, we don't only want to be using like our script in the console. We want to be, including JavaScript in projects that we make ourselves and having it do things depending on, what page the user is viewing, depending on what the page the user is clicking, on a bunch of different factors. So just working off of our kind of poor example here, with our little boxes. Same code as we saw yesterday. We have our basic HTML page, and it's including the fonts and the style sheet. So just like with CSS, we have kind of two main ways that we can include. Well, CSS had 3, but JavaScript's going to have 2, and they overlap in a very similar way to CSS. We can do embedded script. So I can do an opening script tag and a closing script tag. Between these two tags, I can write any JavaScript. So we could do document dot get element by ID. I've got an ID here of demo, and then we can do inner HTML. That means I want to set what HTML occurs between the opening and closing tag of, this div. We'll set that to and then when this page runs, it will look for an element with an ID of demo, and then it will dynamically change the content at this point. So we give this a refresh. And the first thing, nothing changes. And we see an error popping up here in our console that says, cannot read property at inner HTML of null. Looking at our document, what might be the reason for that?
JavaScript is loading faster. Before the elements get loaded, it's looking for that ID.
Yeah, exactly. So at this point, while the document is loading, an element with the ID demo does not exist. So this initial search is returning null. And then I'm trying to do .inner HTML on something that's null, giving me an error, not updating anything that I have down here. You'll see that like an errand script is not going to halt any rendering of your HTML stuff. So that's fine. It will halt other, like if we had more things to happen, that stuff's not going to happen because of the error. But yeah, we have this problem where our script can't interact with the HTML because it doesn't exist yet. So one option, and what was common for a long time, was to include your script tags after your HTML stuff. So it runs only after this stuff has been loaded in the browser. So if we save that and refresh, oh, I'm also just using the function wrong. Oh no. Let's double check. JavaScript, inner HTML. Nope, first one. Oh, yes. So we're setting the property, we're not calling the function. And finally, we get our big text showing up inside of our box div. And we get the console log showing up here. But same problem we would have with embedded CSS, we now have with embedded JavaScript. This is maybe fine for this one line of code, but we start adding more stuff, and it's going to be really unorganized and hard to maintain. So our other option is that we can include the same script tag, but we give it a source on where to load in an external JavaScript file. So we'll get in a script.js from the same path or folder that this guy is in. Script. Yes. I am external. And now we're loading in our scripts from both sources. You can pull in as many scripts as you need, and you're going to want to divide up your actions and tasks into different scripts. We don't want to just include every single thing that we're going to be doing JavaScript in this one script tag, because the same thing, it can get long and unruly. So if we have a certain functionality that is for updating tweets, we have a certain other functionality that might be better encapsulated in another file, we might want to separate them into different scripts. And that's totally okay and fine. The last thing to think about in including scripts, including them after the body is fine. It leaves you safe to know that the HTML has been loaded. But with HTML5, there's a few other options. If we really want to leave our script up in the head, because organizational-wise, it makes a bit more sense. In the head, we're already including all of the resources that we need for this web page. So why not also include our scripts? Why do we have to scroll to the bottom to see what we're using? So there are some different keywords or tags that you can throw into your script to tell the script to load in a different way. The first one is defer. And this will tell your script to essentially do what it was doing when it was down here after the body. Wait until all of the HTML has loaded, and then load the script, and then run the script. The other option is to mark it with async, which will tell the script to asynchronously load as the HTML is loading. And then only when the script has finished loading, pause the HTML from rendering to run the script. And this is kind of best viewed in, I've got an image here. So if we just include a normal script tag at the top, the second that the parser hits that script, it's going to pause any further parsing of your document. It's going to take the time to first fetch that script and then execute the script. And then with async, it will continue to load our HTML while it is fetching the script. And then it'll only pause the HTML when it can run the script. And then lastly, defer is just, we're going to wait until the very end, all of our document has been parsed, then we'll execute that script. In practice, most of the time, you're going to be using defer or just throwing your script tags at the bottom after the body. I would recommend using defer simply because it keeps you a little more organized with all of your resources at the top of your document.
The async function is actually not working right? I mean, it's not a good way of doing it, because if it's executing the JavaScript before the HTML completely loads up, then I still have an error.
Yes, assuming that you're only ever going to be loading JavaScript to interact with your DOM. There are cases where you might be doing JavaScript to do other things. Like if we had a script that really didn't care what happened between these two body tags, then we don't necessarily have to wait for them to all load. So there are cases where it's not as important, and async is a good option for that because it doesn't block your rendering. So the other maybe thing to think about is if we have a script and it doesn't depend on any of this stuff, there still is a reason for it not to be at the top here if we weren't marking it with defer or async. Think of the situation where we're running a script and it's a big, long script. It has to do a lot of things. That's going to block any of our HTML stuff from rendering on the page, and the user is going to see like a visible wait time before content appears. So even in the case where we don't care about DOM elements in our script, we still probably want to do either defer or an async, depending on our needs. Before we go on, there's like other things that maybe we'll try in our external script. So we are getting our demo and we're setting the inner HTML. There's also a container here. So in our script, we'll go document.get element by class name. We'll get our container. And the other main motivation, we can now change CSS, modify how it looks. We also sometimes want to add new content. So we can do an append to our node that we just grabbed from our search. We'll append the child, and we can give that new content to show. We could append to the child just like text, but often we might want to be appending actual like HTML nodes themselves. Because if we just go like this, we're very limited in what we can make. So instead, beforehand, we'll do a document, and then we have the option to create an element. And we can decide what type of element we want to create. So maybe we'll create like an H1 element, and then we'll append. Well, there's no use creating an H1 if it's empty, so maybe we'll save it to a variable title. And then we'll do title.inner HTML. We'll set that equal to I am a new H1. And then to the container, we'll append a child title. Ooh. And we'll see that this popped up only because I was looking at it earlier, but it is a good segue into using Chrome DevTools. So we've looked at elements yesterday when we were talking about CSS. You've used the console throughout your development. Another tab, sources, is very useful, especially when we're using client-side JavaScript. On the left here, we can see all of the external resources that our page is needing. We've got our HTML document, we've got our external JavaScript, and we've got our CSS. When we click on our script, the reason that this paused is because a breakpoint was set here. Clicking on any of these lines, we can turn on and off a breakpoint. If you mark a line of your script with a breakpoint, the browser will halt when it reaches that line, and this can help you do some like debugging to see at that point what has happened in our browser. You can then use this little arching arrow to step to the next line of JavaScript. In our case, we hit an error. But if we had, say we mark it earlier and I refresh the page, we can jump to line 2 and then line 3 and then line 4, and then finally we'll hit our error. In our console, we should see some information. So one option, or one case here, we're doing get elements, so plural by class name. And then we're trying to run append child. If we pause for a second and just console log what we're getting here. I'll take off the breakpoint, jump to the end. We'll see that we have another HTML collection like we first saw with our images. So on a collection, like on an array, we can't call an individual function of what's inside the array. And this makes sense. And this is maybe a continuation of yesterday when we were looking at the difference between an ID and a class. With JavaScript now, we have options to get element singular by ID. So when we call this, we can be guaranteed that either nothing is returned or a single element is occurred, because each tag should only be labeled with one ID, and one ID can only occur once. Whereas with class names, we are not sure whether there is one or many. So our search could return one, it could return many. It's returned in an array. So in order for us to append a child on there, we have to try it on the first thing that is returned from our get elements by class. So we get a new header showing up, and it's appended to the end of our HTML. We appended it to container. It's showing up right at the end there. At this point, it doesn't really seem like there's a huge advantage to doing this, maybe, because we're doing all of this stuff the second that the browser loads. So it's like if I'm just going to set a new h1 tag right when the browser loads, why don't I just come down here and create it, right? But of course, JavaScript allows us much more flexibility than that. We can have a bunch of logic in here deciding which thing we might render, what conditions are present. Maybe there's certain conditions that want us to create the page in one way. There's other conditions that allow us to create a page in the other way. And then the third way that this really starts to stand out different is we can do things on actions that the user does. So not right off the bat when the script loads, but after a user clicks on something, after a user inputs something, after a user does one of many, many things available to them. Each of these things that we can track is an event in our browser. So events are actions or functions that occur as a result of the user action or as a result of the state change of the elements of a DOM tree. So each node in that tree that we looked at has an event handler attached to them. Once an event is triggered, you can call the handler so that certain actions occur. All these events, occur for different things. We have mouse events, we have keyboard events, we've got form events. There are literally a crazy amount. So if we look up now, this is just some examples.
Are you looking for DOM events?
So we can say so you have this whole chunk of mouse events, keyboard events, frame events, form events, and on and on and on. So there is something that you want to wait until the user does something on the page. There is most certainly an event associated with that user action that you can tie a function to. So in our case, say we wanted to wait until the user clicked on this number 5 box, and then we added I am a new H1. We would have to first find the box that we're looking for, and we can give it maybe an ID of create. We're going to find that element. And we are going to say the onClick the action associated when this node is clicked should be some function. We can do an inline function here. We could do a predefined function. It's up to us. And then we can say, so when that's clicked, let's do all of the stuff that we were doing on load before and create this new H1. So we don't have that H1 at this point. If I click here, 1 shows up. If I click again, we can just keep spawning them in. But there are events for like when a user inputs something into a form. There are events when someone submits a form. There are events if something is focused on or not focused on. Again, there's just like a ton out there. It's not something that you're going to have to memorize, but as you use more and more events, you'll be familiar with what is available to you. And you can just keep referencing to like different documentation sources to see what type of events that you can use. Great. Any questions on our events or front-end JavaScript at this point? Cool, cool. Does anyone want to read? Yeah. I need a volunteer to read. Yeah, out loud. Not just in your head. It'll be really thematic. I'll get you some music. What's the helicopter song? There you go. All right. Okay, we still need a volunteer though.
Read what?
Okay, we have a little bit of history for the DOM and for JavaScript.
Damn.
Okay, wait. Here we go. All right. So this is our history.
I would read the entire.
Yeah.
It was the browser wars of the late 1990s, the titans of the web, Netscape Navigator and Microsoft Internet Explorer were both pioneering new implements of war. First, Netscape revealed JavaScript, an asynchronous language that allowed the browser to run client-side code. Not to be outdone, Microsoft quickly, learning from its competitor, released JavaScript, its own re-implementation of JavaScript. With these new scripting languages unleashed, advocates of both sides began modifying HTML documents and implementing limited customities for detecting user-generated events. Little did they know, this clearing of JavaScript, JScript, and HTML documents would become known as a legacy DOM. Legacy DOM was limited in the kinds of elements that it could access, but powerful nonetheless. The war raged on, quickly becoming a battle of the dawn. Each browser fighting, desperate for worldwide web supremacy. Each side pursuing the limits of what was browser possible. This is where the intermediate DOM was born, molded. Eventually, the battle of the DOM grew too much. Someone had to step in. With the standardization of a CMA script, the W3C decided to intervene. A W3C DOM working group began drafting a standard DOM specification so that DOM use would be safely regulated and controlled henceforth. And thus, DOM Level 1 emerged, allowing for more consistent development across browsers.
Nice job. Good reading. Yeah. So the browser wars of the late 1990s. Most of these guys weren't present. It was mostly between Netscape Navigator and Microsoft. Early in the web days, there was like this kind of big competition between the two of them to see who would get kind of market share. And they were both pushing to see like what the browser could do in new ways. So we saw here that Netscape Navigator, they created JavaScript. Microsoft created their own version, JScript. But out of this like battle, they started experimenting with how these scripting languages could interact with the HTML and do different things. So one side would say like, hey, now we should be able to take and wait until a form is inputted and then do something. And the other side would be like, okay, let's do this other thing. And as a result, for web developers, this was like exciting, but created like a ton of pain early on, just because of the inconsistencies between one side and the other. Like even, oh, there's JavaScript and then there's JScript. They work very similar ways, and obviously JScript is not something that comes up a lot anymore. But that's also the reason that we have ECMAScript being the kind of like governing body deciding how JavaScript changes, is because we couldn't say there's a JavaScript governing body. ECMAScript is thinking about both JavaScript and JScript. But in the same way, like that was kind of weird and like was unsure which one would win out. The document object model was also in a similar state until around, I don't think it says here, I think it was like 2003 or so, that like the W3C decided that there needed to be like some regulation or specifications on how this would look, so that when you access certain objects in one browser, you could do the same script in another browser. It didn't like level the field, but it did provide some standardization. And so we had like similar problems to reset and normalize that we needed in CSS within JavaScript. There was like difference whether you were on one side or the other. Awesome. We're going to break for 15 minutes. thanks, Tasa, for reading this super long block of text. And we'll come back at 11:03, if that's good with everyone.
I can't. I can't. I can't.
What?
Well, this is block, but like lol, right? And then like you hit 3. It's not supposed to refresh, right? And then bam. So it works. Everything works. But I can't get like look at this. So div, right? Position absolute. Well, the div is inside a header. Like I just changed this entire like the entire like it wasn't structured like this. I just put these two in the same div so that it's like more manageable, I guess, in a sense. But what I'm trying to do is the outside header. I want this to be. I don't know what I want it to be. Like I said, position relative here, but
Yeah.
what I want it to be is like as I'm scrolling through. Oh, well, this will get longer as you get more tweets, right?
Yeah.
I want this thing to be not a header, but like a sidebar where it stays. So
Yeah.
right now, if I do. This is so fucking well. Look at it.
I mean,
it just breaks.
fix is how you want to do it, but you're just
Yeah.
gonna have to change
How
how
the
it's
parent
it's styled. Like, its width is 70%. It needs to be 50% because when you absolute, it's gonna be
of the page.
Yeah.
Of the page.
and then you need it to be on the left side. Like, there's a couple things you'll need to switch.
Okay. So it's just like the dimensions that I need to do, right?
Probably mainly that, yeah.
Okay. Ah, right. Because when you're doing fixed and absolute, it's relative to the viewport, not to the parent element.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay. Yeah, I'll change that up right now.
Cool. Hey, how's it going? So,
I had a quick question. So
yeah.
in the HTML file, you have when you link the JavaScript file, external JavaScript file to that, you use either defer and async, right?
Yeah.
So if when you don't have that, I mean like in your external file, if you have a line of code that says like document.ready, then you wouldn't need to put in like defer and async.
Yeah.
Would that be the case?
Well, sort of, because you would still have the problem where your script's here, even if you're using document.ready, it's still loading before the page can show any content.
Right.
So that would also be a problem. Like if you have a really big script that you're loading in, even though you're waiting for document.ready for it to run, it still has to take some time to load before it shows other stuff. Yeah.
So is that a better practice to put it at the bottom?
Well, or to use defer, and then a document.ready is still a good thing to do, but it's like, yeah, so you're safe on either side.
Difference between defer and async? They're normally the same.
So defer was that like they're very similar. Defer was like it waits until the HTML is finished rendering completely before it loads or executes the script, whereas async will interrupt the thing to run the script. So
Faster.
you could think it'll be faster to run the script, yeah, for sure. So you can think of like if you had a really big HTML page and there's like 1,000 paragraph tags, it's parsing first, second, third. It gets like the 500th one, and then the script is finished. The script runs, and then it continues hitting the rest. Whereas defer, it'll always finish all of them and then render the script at the end, or run the script at the end.
So for async, you might have that error message. Right?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, unless you're using the document ready. Yeah.
So the HTML that comes up after executing the script
Mm-hmm.
come up, then you might have error message.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's safer to do defer.
Yeah, like this has some.
It's gonna be faster, but
It's has more specific use cases where it's like sometimes good to use, but more often you're going to use defer. Yeah. No worries.
Have you seen the Mandalorian, Travis?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really good.
I'm waiting for Christmas
To catch up on it? No, it's really good so far. Sorry.
I have a problem here. I defined this one, the text area, to get the input, but it shows me like this. And it couldn't see anything here. When I define it inline on my HTML, it worked here. But I can't use it here. It can't see this part.
Like it's not grabbing that style. Do you want to put it here for a second? I mean, anytime I'm not sure if something's being applied, I usually come in here.
Here I can do it,
But
but
we,
I added it. My CSS, it doesn't work.
so it is coming in. No, it's not. No. Yeah, so it's not, the CSS isn't being applied at all. So that could be a problem in how you're linking this CSS. new tweet.css. Mm.
When I set it here as an input,
Mm-hmm.
it worked as an inline.
Yeah.
HTML it worked, but inline in my CSS. Let's see. There, it's showing up now. It might have been that your server didn't register the changes. I'm not sure. Okay.
Yeah. No worries. Okay, we're gonna get started. Sorry, my computer died for a bit there back. I don't know what happened, but we're good to go now. I did modify our script a little bit so that now on click of our top right box, we are creating a new div element. I'm saying the inner HTML just to an asterisk, and then I'm giving it a class name of box, and then I'm appending it to the creator. This way, when we click on this guy, we get new boxes showing up with all of the style that we've already assigned to the box class. And then many as well. The last important thing to think about when we are handling events. So our syntax here, we are handling the on-click event for our create box with this function. Anytime we're doing event handling, the browser or the DOM is going to pass to us an event object to our handler. So when we click, this will be passed to any callback that we're attaching to an event. This event thing is an object and has information on what event occurred, what the event occurred to, and other things like that. So we can go in here and we'll just console log. We can see what the event type is. We can also see what the event target is. Over here, the event was a click event, and the target was this dot object. You're going to find this event object as passed to your handlers very helpful in certain cases. For example, I know with Tweeter, you're eventually going to be creating an input text field, so you can type in a new tweet and then hit like post or send or create tweet, whatever the button says. By default, forms are going to refresh your page. When you submit a form, it is trying to do a HTTP request to some path, and it will trigger a page refresh. When you are handling the submit with JavaScript, you don't necessarily want the page to refresh. So you can grab the event that just occurred, and you can tell it to not do the refresh. The way you would do that would be you're going to take the event, find the target of the event, and then you're going to prevent the default. So whatever default action would be occurring, you're stopping it. But there's other things you can do with the event. One just like pure standpoint is if we want to do something to the thing that was just clicked, we now have that object. Any questions come up over the break? People were thinking about scripting in the browser. Cool. The next thing that we're going to look at is something called jQuery. This is like their own summary, or jQuery's own summary of what it is. It's a fast, small, so they're really talking themselves up, and feature-rich JavaScript library. It makes things like HTML document traversal and manipulation, event handling, animation, and AJAX much simpler and easy to use, or much simpler with an easy-to-use API that works across multiple browsers. So we've seen a little bit of kind of native browser JavaScript so far, our stuff in here. It's not terribly difficult to use, but there were, when we're grabbing an ID or trying to find something by an ID versus trying to find something by class name, those are a bit different. We have to use different search things for each search that we're looking for. The jQuery is the idea that this type of JavaScripting in the browser could be made easy. So their library provides a bunch of functionality that doesn't really add new things to what we can do. If you can do it in jQuery, you can do it in pure JavaScript, but it makes it easy for us. jQuery is an external library, so in order to use it, we either have to download that library and include it it in our project, or we can link to it with like a CDN. CDN standing for Content Delivery Network. All it is, so if we want to do jQuery 3 point whatever, we can get the uncompressed version, and this is a link where this jQuery file is externally stored on the web. So I can just copy this and include it in the head of my file. But if I were to actually go to this path, we would just see all of the text or all of the code that makes up jQuery. So this is jQuery. It's just a long JavaScript file that defines all of the things that jQuery is. So copy that. Thinking about our script tags, what would be the best place for me to include this kind of jQuery library? After link, so here. Okay. So it's like, he's not copying my footprint. So in here, yeah, we could do that. Yeah, it is just loading up the file. We will still run into that problem because jQuery is really big. I mean, I don't think we'll notice it, but we can test. Maybe there's a slight slower. I don't think so. But you know, it could be a concern of ours. So one thing we do have to make sure is that we include our jQuery script before any of our other scripts where we want to use jQuery. Our document's going to be loading these files in order. So if in script.js we're using some jQuery stuff and we include it above where we get jQuery, we won't have it available. Unlike in Node JavaScript, where we have a very well-defined way of including other JavaScript files, you know, we do require and we export stuff. When we require something in, we're just getting the specific things from that file that were exported and we're saving it to a variable. In client-side JavaScript, if you are including a script, it is globally, the scope of that script is available kind of throughout your HTML and throughout your other script files. So if I were to create, like I created a text array here, if I have another script, I can access this text array because it's in global scope. Of course, normal scoping rules still apply. So within a function, like I create a box, this variable is not available outside of this function in this document or in any other document. But anything that's global in this document, I will also be able to access in, say, script2, which could be just included right after it. Because of this, we can use all the things that are in jQuery in our original script. And the biggest thing that jQuery initially is going to help us with is just finding DOM elements or finding nodes in that DOM tree. It's, from my understanding, the reason the library is called jQuery, with a $sign, open and close parentheses, we can query across our document for IDs, classes, tags, and we have a lot of flexibility in what we're looking for. Instead of having to specify we want to get by ID or get by class name or get by tags, we can just, using similar syntax to CSS, say we want to get stuff that is a box. And this will grab all of the elements that have the class.box. all of these different divs and boxes inside of them. Or we could grab, what was our ID? Create. We could get this action as well. The jQuery documents are really good. So as you're working with it, check it out. We have all of these different functions that we can apply to our jQuery nodes. If we look up jQuery selectors, you can see the different ways we can use selector fields inside of those parentheses. We can do all selectors. We can select for certain animations. We can select for prefixes, where attributes equal a certain thing. So if we look at this one, here, they're selecting for all inputs that have the value attribute set to hot fuzz. And then they're changing the next thing, so the next element in the, or the next sibling to the word hot fuzz. So I guess this would be selected, and it's changing the span name to hot fuzz. You'll get more comfortable with this as you explore, but the main theme is just things are a bit easier with jQuery. When jQuery was first created back in 2006, there was a little more motivation for having a library like this. This is just after those kind of confused browser days that we talked about. The one problem was the inconsistencies between client-side JavaScript in different browsers. So jQuery stepped in and said, we'll make writing client-side JavaScript a little bit easier, and we'll also make sure that it's very consistent across any browser. So when in this example, set the text of an element to something, jQuery behind the scenes would make sure that even if there was different ways that you could do that from, say, Explorer and Netscape, it would even those out so that the same thing happened. So early on, that was really important. And JavaScript, as we might have heard of or seen, is something that's evolved a lot over time. So back in 2006, it was very different than it is today. There's a lot of new functionality and a lot of new features that have been applied to JavaScript since 2006. We've been dealing with ES6 features. A lot of those are nice quality of life updates. There's also been new changes to the DOM API, so that some of the problems that once existed with client-side JavaScript are now not as problematic. So for that reason, jQuery is not as huge as it once was. There was a point where virtually across the board, every website, every application was using jQuery and used it to some extent. But it is still very relevant. More than 55% of the most 10,000 most visited sites are using jQuery. It is, for that reason, all of this legacy and continuing sites being built on this, it helps to know and be able to use it. Another reason that jQuery was and still is very popular is that it's a highly extendable library, meaning there's a lot of plugins or additional chunks of code that you can add to jQuery that lets you to do almost any sort of if you want to do a really cool animation that does this, you can probably look up a jQuery plugin that will help you with that. If you want to be able to handle form inputs and validate them, there's probably a jQuery plugin that you could do something similar. Yeah, but let's So one of the reasons it's not, well, one is like we were talking about, the inconsistencies in the browser is less so to this point. So we don't need something between us and the browser, because they'll be consistent from Chrome to Firefox to Safari to a large extent. The second thing is there's been new things added. So while this is kind of annoying, there is now a document querier. So we can do and this function is kind of similar to the jQuery $ query. So it's actually pretty long. Yeah, it's true. It's not as elegant as jQuery. Um, there is like some inclination to not use. I mean, jQuery here said that they're like super lightweight and small, um, but there's a lot of stuff in there. If you're only using it for doing this nice query, it might be too much. So some people feel that I don't want to include this whole library when I'm not using it very extensively, and then something like query select is still good. There's also like previously CSS animations were not as comprehensible as they are today. You know, we can take probably haven't looked at it too much, but we can on hover, on click, drastically change the CSS of different elements within our document. And so a lot of that can be covered with CSS. Before, that was done purely in like JavaScript, and jQuery provides a bunch of like really cool functions that you can do animations or showing and hiding things really easy. There's that part too. That's less important. But all I'd say is it doesn't. I'm not saying that jQuery is not relevant or popular, because it is still very much both of those things. It's just the context that we are currently at in web development needs jQuery to a bit of a lesser extent than it did back in 2006 and before. Another reason that jQuery maybe is not as important is there's a lot of really big front-end frameworks like React, Angular. React will be covering later in the bootcamp, which covers some of the things that jQuery used to be, or jQuery still does, like being able to dynamically create new elements in the DOM. A lot of front-end frameworks cover that in a different way. So we just have a more comprehensive ecosystem for front-end development. So jQuery is not the only player now. So this question here, like how much additional behavior does it add to the browser? None. It's functionally equivalent to pure JavaScript. It just makes things easier. And like we're talking about jQuery, I've already mentioned it as a library. These words will start to come up more and more now that we're kind of past the fundamentals. Well, jQuery is a library, React is a framework, all this other thing, library, framework. It helps for us to start to differentiate between the two. And the lines do get blurred to some degree. A library is something, it often is like a collection of functions, but it helps you to do what you want to do. You can still do what you're trying to do in the way that you want to, but it makes that easier for you. Frameworks, on the other hand, are more opinionated. They help you to do what you want to do, but they also say you should do it in a certain way. Or they have an opinion on how things should be done. So with jQuery, I can do stuff kind of in any way that I want, and then just pick and choose the different functions it makes available to me to make my life easier. Whereas a framework would say, yeah, you can do all these things, but you should do it this way. There's a best way to like organize the project. There's a best way to control your logic. A lot of these things, the more you're restricted in how you do something, the more likely that you're using a framework versus a library. But even in this is like another kind of nice quality change. When we did this with pure JavaScript, we got an error because when we're selecting like a general thing, um, we had an array, and it was like you can't just append or you can't change the style of an array. You have to loop through and apply anything you're looping. jQuery knows that we want to apply maybe one change to a group, and so we can use its functions on groups and have it, throw tests on every paragraph that appears in the browser. Or maybe we want to go maybe there's some H2s in here, and we want to change the CSS, have a background color blue. What is it? Oh, spam. Okay, well let's browse spam. We're popping over to documentation, let's look at CSS, and make sure we're using our functions right. So the function I was using is just receiving the style of upstream. So we've got CSS to get the values in the style properties for the first element in the set to match elements or set font or bold spacing properties for every match element. So how do we set it then? And then the values.
Bold needs to be coach.
Sorry.
I think bold needs to be in coach. That's what documentation says.
So which part needs to be in coach? Can you explain?
In coach, yeah, like background, and then dot dot. Yeah, dot dot.
Dot dot.
Yeah.
Oh, like colon?
Yep. And then color. But background color needs to be in coach. And then colon. And then color, that red or whatever. That needs to be in colon too.
So if we did it this way, we would need to include everything. Separate coach. I don't know if this is gonna. The other way it was showing was to include the properties and then the values. So there we go. You just gotta expand this one. But with jQuery we can do a lot of the same things we were doing back over here in our script. One important function that you'll see that makes the workflow a little bit easier is if we select a document object, jQuery has a .ready function that takes in a callback. This ready function will run everything in the callback when all of the HTML for the page has been loaded. So this makes it kind of really simple for avoid that problem that we saw earlier where we were trying to modify a particular DOM element and it didn't exist yet. This will ensure that like no matter where we put our script tag in our file, it always executes, or at least executes this part after everything that's going to be there is there. So nothing will change for us because we're including it after the fact. And then if we pop over here, we could move our script and not have the defer, and we'll still be able to like grab all of the things that happen in network. We added a on-click here. We can also add events to elements in jQuery. So dollar sign, this is a ID. We can grab that node element and just do click. And click gives us the callback that will run when the document is clicked. We also have available the same event in this callback if we want to. And the pattern through all the jQuery is going to do the same thing, but obviously the fewer lines of code, it makes things a bit easier for us. A big area where it makes stuff easier is in creating things. In Tweeter, you're going to have to be appending new tweets onto your tweet like div whenever someone posts one. There are a few ways that you can do this. So we created a div here. One way is to say box.inner HTML and just format everything that's going to say be inside your tweet as a long string. So we need H1, or H2 maybe, which is like the tweet name. And then we need a footer with some stuff in it. Maybe this footer needs class name. And so on and so forth. Or you can make it component by component, where we might go the jQuery method, let box equal the same jQuery $ brackets that we're going to be creating an element this time. We want maybe a div for our tweet. Maybe it has a class of tweetbox with tweet container or whatever.
Can we do that multi-line? Like div, and then on the next line I get T, and then on the next line I get H.
You mean like right here?
I mean not on a single line. Like I wanna break it down into multiple lines so that it becomes kind of like an HTML view. Like
Yeah. So there are ways you can do that. With this, I think we can just use, can we use backticks? Okay, we could do it with backticks, and then of course, like there are going to be dynamic things that we want in here. So if we're using backticks and template literal strings, we could say this will be something different each time. And then further down, so on and so forth. So you can do it multiple lines. If you want to make it a little more modular too, you can then take this box and we can like append, like inside the tweet box, maybe we want a header. And header like this. And then to the stuff isn't really styled. But if we look at it, it is a div that has a tweet inside of it, or sorry, a tweet div that has a header inside of it. And we could continue this buildup of things. We could be including class stuff in here, or we can be applying it after the fact. Headers class. Function, then go back to the documentation and see what we use the class. Add class. Class. With jQuery, we are listening to the specific event here, but we can attach a callback handler to any event with a generic. So let's grab every. Grab every box, and then we can say on, which is adding an event listener. First parameter will be whatever event we're listening for. So we could listen for a click. We could listen for hover, and then we have our callback function that will be triggered when that occurs. When an event is happening within a jQuery callback, you can refer to the thing that the event is happening to with the keyword this. So if we do $ bracket this, we're grabbing the box that is being hovered on, and then maybe we want to CSS.
You have to write the word function.
So it's not hover, it's mouse over. Well, I'm using arrow function. So this is equivalent to this in terms of making the function. This is the ESX version. There is a little bit of a difference between an arrow and a function in terms of this. So you need to be a bit careful. Should be fine. Totally could be. Yeah. So that's actually a really good example of the difference between your function expression and arrow declaration. With our arrow function, this is bound locally. With the normal function, this is bound in the context of where it was called. So because jQuery has the context of this, we want to use this movement. And that's like most DOM is just finding the thing that you're trying to target and either listening for events or changing them. You just have to experiment with what events are available to you and what changes you can do with JavaScript. If you're doing stuff like we just did here, there's a lot of cases where you can do that just with CSS. This one's a little different because it stays highlighted after the key. So ask a mentor, say like, hey, I want to do this style change. Should I do this with jQuery and JavaScript? Should I do it with CSS? Get a feel for those two. For dynamically updating content, like creating new stuff, you are for sure going to have to do that with JavaScript. And then tomorrow, we're going to get into more on what client-side JavaScript can do with something called Ajax. Ajax allows us to do HTTP requests inside of client-side JavaScript and get the result all without refreshing the page. So that'll give us some like cool abilities to say, after you load the page, we can dynamically get more things from other sources. And when we get those new things, we might have to do something like this to create and show the data in a helpful way. So as an example, we have like a big array here of objects. This might be data that we're getting from our server or from our external server. Maybe we have a function that goes through this array and takes the data and creates one of these boxes. On click create, for each pet of pets. Let's create a new box, and we'll append it to the container. Well, let's make all the data inside of these boxes be dynamic. So for each pet, we have a name, height, and age. In our div, we will get the name, and then in our header, we can get to age, age. So we click on this guy, get all of our different pets coming out ASAP. Dingo age 1, type dog. Pongo age 2, type snake. Nyongo. Mewtwo, this guy should be in age 2, type cat. So with a bit more style and maybe getting this dynamically, we can start to think of how client-side JavaScript is going to really open up our doors on what we can do. Cool. I know today's lecture wasn't like revolutionary. Like you guys know JavaScript. It's not super crazy to now be able to do it in the client. Thanks for sticking with me for this one. Any questions before we kind of close off the lecture? That's everything that we need to cover. Yeah.
It seems like a lot of the same stuff that we can do with this is sort of similar to how we would do like Ajax as a template engine for time map.
Mm-hmm. ways of doing the same thing, but more often than not, they're complementary. And the one thing to remember is that EJS, even though you have your like sharp brackets and you insert JavaScript in there, all of that JavaScript is being rendered server side. So what Express does is you send it your request, it knows maybe the data depending on your cookie and depending on the database. It passes all that stuff down in template bars over to your EJS template. Express runs that template, running all the JavaScript in there and converts it into like a plain HTML markup, and then sends it over to the client. And the client like gets it and sees whatever it needs to see. So from a purely like data standpoint, if we just have a page and we want to put information in it from the server, they both can be the same thing. The difference between the two would be whether one is a single page application or one is a kind of non-single page application, like a traditional website. And this is like what we'll look at tomorrow. Let's say with like Wikipedia, this could be done with like EJS templates. It isn't, but like the way it's built is different. When we click on a particular article, there's a request to the server, followed by a response giving us this new HTML page, and we see that there was like a, up here is like a refresh of the page, right? It happens very quick, but it's still there. Whereas if we go on something like Reddit, and we click on, there's a nice wholesome subreddit. If I click on this, there's no page refresh, but I'm getting new information to the page. So the same, I'm getting new content from a server, but they're happening differently. One is happening server side, one is happening client side, and there are benefits, pros and cons to each, and we'll look at some of those differences tomorrow. But that's the one difference. The other thing that client-side JavaScript really applies on top of this is there's just certain interactivity, like animations, drop downs. A lot of go to Compass. Any of like no one's going to see like this. Any of like these drop down things. A lot of it is like client-side JavaScript, although less and less the more CSS has been taking on. Stuff like that is also good news for us. Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, like, what are the pros and cons of like client side versus server side?
When we're thinking of like single page applications versus
Yeah, that's right, that's right.
We'll dive more into those tomorrow. Like I think it's a good part of tomorrow's lecture, so I don't want to take too much of your time today and then end up getting repeated tomorrow. But yeah, there are benefits and cons to both styles of pages, and that's why you still see, traditional and single page applications showing up in the web.
You can have a combination of both, right? Like you can have a multi-page thing, but then like you can have a certain like subdomain of it that like only refreshes.
Yeah, for sure. And you'll see that in the future as well. It's not a hard line between the two camps. You can have, like, if you think of Twitter, the one page that you're showing is dynamic in some ways. You'll be getting new tweets and like posting new tweets and stuff. You could also think of it as having a separate page, maybe like a login page, that you do purely with like EJS templates. So
You can mix and match it if you want.
exactly. Yeah. But yeah, that's everything